Hello. Oscar Marzaroli was born in Italy in the 30s, but spent most of his childhood and all his adult life in Glasgow. Although it didn't provide him with a living, he photographed Scotland and particularly Glasgow over 3 interesting decades through its post-war upheavals, the flattening of condemned tenement areas like the Gorbals, the controversial rehousing project of the 60s, and the recent years of rebirth in its cultural city guise. He was a street photographer, shooting on the wing, reluctant to define himself in any creative terms, and his work is to a large extent accepted in this light as simply a nostalgic record of the city's recent past. Since his death 2 years ago, an appraisal of his life's work has been underway. This film is directed by Bill Forsyth, who wrote and directed Gregory's Girl and Local Hero. Apart from the opening statement by a man who's watched scarcely any British arts documentaries over the past 25 years, yet still feels qualified to journalise about them, I think you'll find the movie man's view of the stills man enjoyable and perceptive.
God, isn't it ironic? Another example of a dead artist getting prime time on TV. Isn't it wonderful? And it actually makes me sick to my stomach, you know? Absolutely. No more time for dead artists. But if you're in Britain, that's the only time you get. You know, the ultimate subversion. Die when you get a good body of work and you know that the work will live longer than time. You know, he must be laughing somewhere. He finally did it right. He put all the bits together at the right time and then he bought it. What a lucky son of a bitch.
Extraordinary that a person you have known and who was a little vain and slowly through the years would clip a few more years off his life for the Bella Fagura. He edged up his birth date to 1933, and it's extraordinary to see an exhibition in the city of his birth with the wrong birthday in our lifetime. He was born in 1930 in La Spezia, and in 1968 he said, well, it's too bad you put my real birth date down there.
I got phoned up and asked to open this. I was quite appalled to realise that I was also making a speech tonight, so I decided that, lest I forget myself, I'd actually bring along some things to say. A lot of you may be wondering what my credentials for speaking about Oscar are, but it's basically because I lose all my bits of paper, which is very like Oscar.
Oscar Marzaroli was an enigma. He was an easy man to like, but a difficult man to know well. Last October, an exhibition of his photographs opened in Glasgow's Kelvin Grove Art Gallery. Oscar photographed Scotland, and particularly Glasgow, for 30 years. This is a very big and prestigious exhibition, but Oscar, when he died in 1988, had only enjoyed 2 or 3 years of local success. His family and their supporters had to find most of the resources to put the exhibition together. The gallery chipped in with a cash fee of £800. You'd have to be successful to afford to show here.
Shades of Grey was a phenomenal success. I think it took everyone by surprise. For a big photographic book, not inexpensive by normal punter standards, you know, to achieve sales of in the region of 15,000 copies in hardback is a considerable achievement. In Scottish terms, it's a bestseller. In UK terms, it'd be creeping into the charts.
The family are now producing both postcards and posters, and the amount of work in the archive, the sheer quality of the images there, we could stock the entire bookshop for decades to come just with Oscar's photographs.
If most artists strive for a sense of detachment from their surroundings, then in wartime Glasgow as a child, Oscar was handed this on a plate.
The Italian thing has always been a very big problem for us, that is Oscar and I, because we couldn't fit in with it when the war broke out. Suddenly feeling as children not any longer one of us. We tallies and papes in a Protestant school, so you can imagine what went on there. For those first 2 or 3 months, it was so intensive, this battling in the school grounds every day. And now I remember that what they were calling us, that is, they were calling us Marzi the Nazi. And this really hurt us. We were so frightened by the thought of it. So it was nearing Christmas, and we were asked what we would like for Christmas. And both of us had agreed, Oscar and I. He was about 7, and I'm I think 10, 12. and he had just started school. And we both said immediately, because we'd talked about it, we want boxing gloves.
My favourite photograph is three women in a Maryhill pub. They're all just laughing. And Oscar's obviously joined in the thing and been there as well. It's great. Clearly, it's not just documentary. It's not just some sort of record, a statistic of what's going on. There's an angle there. And the angle is not that Oscar... The great thing about Oscar is he did not say, I'm going to set up this photograph and you should come away feeling this. He took what was there, but clearly he took it from a very sympathetic angle towards the people who were in that situation. They were people photographs. They were not artistic photographs in the traditional sense. They were just good, solid, human stuff.
After Oscar's death, his wife Anne and daughter Marie-Claire carried on the work that had been started, organising exhibitions, developing relationships with the art world, sponsors, publishers, the media. So far, this is their biggest undertaking, a 200-print show in Glasgow's prime venue. Any world-class photographer might think twice about showing these numbers in one place. And all this started just a few years ago, before Oscar died.
It was in 1983 when I first met Oscar to preview at Third Eye Centre. I'd seen several of his photographs before, but had no idea of the range and extent of his work. Certainly, the work that I'd seen was compelling in the power of imagery and also of great interest because of the Glasgow subject matter. He invited me back to his studio, and there I was astonished to discover an archive stretching back 30 years of very prolific work, which was largely unknown. And we spent hours together going through the prints that he had there. And it was one of the discoveries of a lifetime. And I can remember going home that night quite elated.
As to the general public, though, they seem to be totally unaware of the sheer portfolio that Oscar was able to present. And I don't think even Oscar was aware of just how commercial the photographs could become.
So do you think we should have more of...
Simple yes and no choices that Oscar would have made instinctively now need conversations. Marie-Claire has been obliged to make a full-time job of organising her father's negatives. Oscar was always much more interested in taking a photograph than printing it or cataloguing it. The family's desire to get it right for him now is strong.
At this stage of the exhibition, you've gone through the negative files, you have done the very hard job of selecting what is going into this show. I mean, you're talking about 100,000 negatives and maybe 190 pictures. You've got a big selection job in your hands, so you've done the hard work of selecting from the contact sheets. Then you go on to printing up 10 by 8s, you know, maybe 1,000, 1,500 10 by 8s. Going to see your space, because that's quite important. Trying to visualise how that will look and trying to think, well, for us it's more difficult because we're trying to think, what would Oscar do? How would he see it?
Oscar was a man who would instinctively defer decisions or meetings, who'd avoid debate with critics or curators. Anne doesn't have that choice. She has to face up to the art world and play her part in defining a man who would shy away from definition.
I think he shied by nature away from everything that represented a responsibility of this sort, you know, where the idea itself is so abstract, you know, being a success, you know. What kept Oscar sane was that he really considered himself a nobody, really. And everything that came his way that might have meant, hey, you're somebody, he was very grateful. Grateful that, yeah, that somebody thinks he's somebody and not nobody, because he really thought
You can
he was
only listen
nobody.
to an eccentric brother for
felt
so
that,
long. But there are other and more meaningful voices bending Anne's ear.
There needs to be a very responsible editor to go through the negatives. Because the prints, in some way, are not the primary source of interest, it's the vision of the prince, than to begin doing a couple of
Demands
things.
like these are only now being made of Oscar and his work. Recognition came so late, it's a chore he managed to avoid. He left himself free to engage to the full in his haphazard life as a street photographer.
The work is there to be seen, and the venues for showing the work are i.e. through books or through exhibitions, television, publications, that sort of thing. So that's why I suppose we are sort of carrying on. But I wouldn't say there was a sort of deliberate plan of action behind what Oscar was doing.
Things tended to happen to Oscar. It is surprising that quite a lot of things that he wanted eventually happened. But I don't think that Oscar was ever in any way a careerist. He didn't plan what he was going to do, or even in a sense how he was going to do it. For example, his record of Glasgow was never a systematic one. As an artist, he was drawn to certain areas, certain districts that he felt familiar with, that he enjoyed, that he could respond to. There was no system there. And it was interesting when we were working on Shades of Grey, on both the exhibition and the book, because we had, in a sense, to impose a kind of pattern without falsifying Oscar's way of working or the work itself. We had to give it some structure. And in certain areas, there were things that were missing, that were vital in Glasgow's history or to how the people of Glasgow lived.
Oscar was, like a lot of others, heroically uncommercial. He never really, I don't think, realized the wealth his photographs might provide. In fact, he was quite reckless. He didn't really present them in any coherent way that could in any way give a return to him or his family. He spent a lot of time as a cinematographer and then as a director, and he always would take photographs on the back of that. But he amassed such a huge collection, and I think it was kind of subtly chronicling the changing world that he grew up and continued to live in. But I think only by pressure of his friends was he ever persuaded to have an exhibition or even release a few prints. It was very uncommercial, but I think also all photographs were. You could still pick up in Glasgow 20 years ago an Annan photograph for 3 old pence. Photography has only really just recently come up, thanks mostly to the situation in America, and now people, it's big business. So I suppose now the mechanical vultures of the gallery system will descend on the hordes of photographs, and I hope Oscar's family can at least benefit from that.
Oscar Marzaroli took photographs within the documentary tradition, if you like, and this is a tradition which is very strongly Scottish in my experience, that it's something that comes from the very beginnings of photography, right back in the 1840s. You find it being practiced in Scotland in the most complete and effective way. And that if you look at photographs by, for instance, the earliest and most impressive photographic partnership, David Octavius Hill and Robert Adamson, you find ideas that you could put just as easily into a picture post-documentary series in the 1940s as they belong in the 1840s. So that what Oscar is doing is, in a way, very familiar within that tradition, though it's not an unbroken tradition by any means at all. Now, the kind of photography that I'm interested in, I particularly like, has got mislabeled recently as compassionate photography. It isn't, to my mind, compassionate. What it is something closer to the older term, social documentary. What you're looking at is a photographer who has managed to become a part of the social group that he or she is working with, has either done this by being totally unobtrusive or by being a very sociable person herself.
His subjects, I think, found the whole experience very, very painless, you know, working with Oscar, because it wouldn't seem as if they were even really being photographed. They would meet this guy who would talk to them about their situation, who would sort of put them through the paces, and incidentally he would take a couple of snaps. And that's how it would appear to the subject. It was just very, very skillful approach to people, and a very sensitive way of approaching people.
I could remember him taking shots of a crofter in Lewis, and it was the usual Marzaroli technique. The subject, who was a landlady, didn't really realise that he was busy taking photographs while he persuaded her to allow him to walk with her up the Croft Road to the local grocer's van, which had just arrived, and record this whole transaction. And he was speaking the whole time, chatting about the weather, the clouds, you know, crofting, and Annie was delightfully responding to all of this. And every so often the camera would come up and go click, and another one was in the box.
Oscar knew how to blend. He was an incredible, incredible chameleon in that regard. And he knew, I suspect, for a variety of reasons, how to do that very personally, but he knew that that would set people at ease. And so he could get inside places, inside people's places, inside physical places, simply because he was interesting to be around.
That is a particular and tricky social skill. You either have to be a very entertaining person, or you have to be somebody who is capable of being almost completely unobtrusive. And given that the camera is a weapon, this is very clever indeed.
I guess I find Oscar interesting because on some level his work appears effortless, you know, and there's lots of it. But the best of it has this strange kind of unnerving familiarity to it that suggests that he really did get in there. He got close. He didn't let the camera get in the way of the knowing. Dumb things like those guys, it's a great picture too, on the card of the show, the fisherman, holding up the fish, you know? God damn, that's a photograph and a half. And it seems in 15 million snapshot albums, that same photograph is there. But his is public. And that's not a kind of staid thing. Those are guys presenting with pride something to this man behind the camera.
We tend to think of documentary photography as being something which, again, is this compassionate idea that people would go in thinking to themselves, well, here are the slums, something should be done about the slums, so I'll take photographs. But in fact, quite a lot of this 19th century photography turns out to be, in an odd way, a celebration rather than a criticism of conditions. And for instance, the very famous Thomas Allen photographs taken in the old closes of Glasgow are certainly a condemnation of the conditions, but it is a situation where the city has already decided on a program of slum clearance, that this was the first time that they actually got around to buying up and pulling down buildings, destroying property with the idea of improving people's lives. So that what these photographs are is record shots taken of the buildings before they are razed to the ground. And there is an element of extraordinary optimism and a kind of historical beauty to them, which is entirely appropriate given those circumstances.
In the early 1960s, Oscar began to take photographs in the condemned tenement areas of the city. It's easy to look at these photographs and imagine him being drawn here by a social conscience or the desire to celebrate the passing of a way of life. But Oscar was placed here by his work, as part of a local film crew. In those days of change, the Gorbals was news. This is the kind of film Oscar Marzaroli worked on.
For 100 years, Glasgow has been rebuilding and rehousing its people. Homes for 1 million people, and still the building goes on.
Sponsored documentaries. In Scotland, that was as good as it got in terms of filmmaking, but it gave him a trade that sustained him and provided his living for most of his working life.
Glasgow has now reached its limit on the ground and is having to grow upwards. The elderly are no longer old before their time. Those whom the gods love are less likely to die or waste away in infancy and childhood.
As an assistant film cameraman, he wasn't responsible for the content or the tone of these films. But because of where they took him and what they showed him, they were probably beginning to dictate the kind of photographs he would take. No matter to what vantage point his film work led him, his stills camera was always round his neck.
Glasgow is a pleasant city, standing foursquare on the banks of the Clyde. It is a large, well-built and stately city.
Whatever can be said about films like these, They did provide the only basis for a career in film for anyone wanting to make a go of it in Scotland.
Yes, we belong to Glasgow with affection and pride.
It was during these early days of filming that Oscar seems to have decided to make a longer-term project out of the city and its people, determined to relate to them in a more honest way than the patronising films he worked on.
As with greatness, some are born to misfortune. Some have it thrust upon them. Others bring it upon themselves. No one should need to beg today, but there are still beggars. And as ever, some of them are characters.
If the films kept their distance from the people, then Oscar, from behind the camera, was beginning to develop his own personal bond.
There's a dark side to life in any big city, but the Public Health Service is striving to clear up the conditions which sometimes cause people to live a degrading and often useless life.
The second city of the empire had run out of space. Its air and river were polluted, its social problems enormous. It had to change.
Ten years later, the buildings were still coming down and the same kind of film was still being made. Oscar had moved up the ranks to directing and producing. It does seem that he came to terms with this kind of filmmaking and used his skills to sell the sponsor's message. In turn, they provided him with the opportunities to be places and make his own connections with the city.
In 1960, work began on the biggest urban redevelopment program in Europe. A 20-year program involving
incredible, terrible period of Glasgow's history when the planning department was run by the Luftwaffe and every single street was coming down. Oscar was there taking photographs, commissioned photographs of this absolute apocalypse.
In human terms, it was a staggering situation, more dramatic locally than the war. Whole communities uprooted, 100,000 homes demolished. Still, you'd hardly sense it from the commentary.
Sir Basil Spencer's high-rise flats in Hutchison Town, Gorbals.
Now, the very buildings that Oscar was paid to celebrate have failed so badly, they are under threat of demolition, after barely 20 years. At least the old tenements lasted 5 times as long.
Living with light, space, a sense of freedom.
So I think when you have an Oscar photograph representing, say, the one bar in a single devastated Warsaw-like 1945 clearance, it shows this single bar, which means so much in Glasgow life, what McDermott called for the connoisseurs of the morose. It's this little place that people got out of their heads in. But also it shows the corruption of the city, the fact that only the bars survived because they were controlled in some way we can't really go into here by some city planner who, or not planner, but some politician perhaps, who actually made that bar survive in this derelict. And if you think about it now, there's probably a little wine bar there now with Oscar's photographs in it. The little bar holds out with little photographs, and they represent a little memory of something which perhaps could be used to rebuild back a Glasgow that we all almost lost.
According to the official voices, there didn't seem much concern about what was being lost.
Tenement life, with its jilly pieces and wee shops, is disappearing. In its place, shopping precincts, located with new housing and new roads in mind. Shopping precincts themselves traffic-free, but provided with parking areas so that cars can serve and not confound the housewife and her family. The supermarket, modern abundance matching modern prosperity.
If the films are heroically unmemorable, Oscar's stills maintain their integrity. A glance at a contact sheet defines a working day for Oscar. The Queen Mother on her way to open a bridge, and a Gorbals rag and bone man sharing the same roll of film. Just driving around in his lunch hour, he could, on a good day, find 3 or 4 lasting images, even out of his car window. Images that would become perfect memories for a generation of Glaswegians. This was Oscar working at his best.
This photograph, for example, goodness knows what's happened to these people now, but you can actually see beyond the sentiment there. It's a dialogue, and I can hear Oscar chatting to them. The little boy is a little frightened of him because he's a very big man, but the girl is entranced and the little baby doesn't know where he is. You can see he's slightly off to the left, and he's He's down here with his rolleiflex looking in, and he's talking at the same time, and these kids are responding, he's telling a story, and he's got this photograph and there's dialogue in it.
Oh, he's probably saying, well, hey, what are you photographing me for? You know, what's important about me? But I think that has something to do with the stuff that Oscar was made of. He just felt there was a connection, a real connection between these people and him, and identified himself also with them.
You better watch your...
Oscar's job took him all over Scotland, but over the years, the films didn't change much.
Loch Ness, home of the fabled monster, home too of the first major industrial development in the Highlands of Scotland.
He did the job that the board at that time was looking for. Of that, there is no question. But at the same time, the board had, by chance, and certainly not by design on the board's part, had provided him with a kind of magic carpet to get around the Highlands and Islands, which is an area that he was not too familiar with. And it was on these journeys that he took a lot of his stills for his own purposes.
This took him around Scotland and in his Volvo, and he was able to buy lots of other cameras. He gave up his rolleiflex and the idea of taking photographs at mid-height and so on. And I think his security made it less possible for him to take the photographs that we so admire now. I may be wrong in that, but I feel that adversity was what he was actually photographing, and he had a sort of communion. He was not a flash person, and he talked in the same language.
You did have the very strong feeling that what Oscar was really there for, and that what was really going to sort of matter, was what he would apparently incidentally shoot on his stills camera, and that the job in hand, the main job that we all thought we were there to do, was really kind of taking a back seat.
It's not hard for a still photograph to seem to be the holder of some kind of truth. It captures a real moment. In Oscar's case, mostly human moments. A photograph is silent and non-committal. It doesn't impose its will on you, but demands that you relate to it. Maybe that's what gives it its aura of integrity.
That lunar desolation won't last long, but there's an army of construction workers assembling, raring to go. Not a Venetian lagoon.
The films that Oscar made are subject to the much more wayward truth of the sponsor's message. They weren't made for posterity. This aluminium smelter, whose construction is being celebrated, was closed down within a dozen years, with the loss of 800 jobs.
There's a curious harmony in the chaos of construction. An engineer's fugue played on a slide rule. That eye-catching steel sphere once symbolized all that was most advanced in fast reactor technology.
Just 20 years after this film was made, it would be impossible to deal with nuclear power in the same eager tones as this commentary did.
The Dounreay project has brought new life to Caithness.
The truth of the sponsored film, and of many documentaries, is a slippery truth, subject to the rhetorical excesses of the commentary, that voice from on high.
Skilled hands at work, hands that can drive a tractor and plough a straight furrow and raise a corn stack and shear a sheep. Hands ready to tackle any job that comes their way. The crofters of Carloway, like their ancient forebears, take fish from the loch, cut peats.
The whole business of documentary photography, film and still, has an air of larceny about it. Images of events and people being stolen and reworked for consumption elsewhere.
John McGregor works at his loom, weaving cloth for the Stornoway mills. Harris Tweed is much more than a cottage industry.
People like John McGregor became merely symbols and in their day were not even required to speak. Now, 20 years later, he can have his say.
A lot of people come here and think, well, if you're an islander anyway, you're bound to be thick. As they say, as thick as two short planks. And some people treat you like that. Quite honestly.
John McGregor has become, on film and in photographs, the timeless image of the island weaver, and not just through his friend Oscar's lens.
for instance, the New York Times article there. Well, you'd be amazed at the repercussions I had from that article. People came into the shed years later with that article, and we found you at last.
Those strange things he did in the Highlands with fishermen and weavers, is just absolutely knockouts, unaffected things, completely intimate and spontaneous pictures without too much guff in between.
For all the accomplishment of his photographs, we know very little about Oscar. He never once volunteered an opinion about what moved him to do the work he did. He would deflect inquiry by calling himself just a snapper. We can easily place him in his time, the 50s and the 60s, and he fits well into the mould of the caring liberal humanist, his heart in the right place. It was the time of coffee bars and duffel coats, a time when political conviction could be summed up in the chorus of a folk song. Oscar wasn't the only one to strike up a relationship with the poorer parts of town. It was a thoroughgoing little industry. You could go and steal some images, package them with a street song, and give the people back instant folk culture. It was awfully easy. At this level, though, the idea of documentary truth was no longer an issue.
Some people, looking at, for instance, the golden-haired lass, or some of the studies of the Gorbals, get the notion that it would be fascinating to find out where the golden-haired lass is now, what she's doing. Now, I agreed with Oscar's view that that was a nonsense. That wasn't what he was about at all. That in fact, if he did discover where she was and what she was doing, that would destroy the original truth that that picture tells you.
So there's sentimental truth as well as documentary truth, and probably a few other kinds as well.
For a wee bobby, devise some coolter's candy. There we saw you're looking awfully thin, a rickle of banes covered her with skin. Now you'll be getting a wee double chin, we soaking coolter's candy.
When Oscar came to make his own statement on film, it fitted the established pattern. He stuck his best photographs on a wall and shot them with a movie camera. Since the best photographs were of Glasgow and the changes being brought about there, that was the subject of his film. He applied the ubiquitous street song. The photographs instantly lost their innocence. Sentiment sang through as clearly as any sponsor's message.
I'm going to make a good Shabbat, shining steel tempered in the fire. We'll chop you down like an old dead tree. Dirty old town, dirty old town.
I have a dilemma with people like him who genuinely do and make in ways that were true for their time. But the problem is that time passes. And unless the ability to remark on truth is exceptional, then the truth can be seen to pass as well. And that's a remarkably sad thing. And for me, a lot of work in that area allows truth to pass with it. A truth that is not so much an absolute, but a sense of being believable, a sense of being valuable still.
And I think his conversation with kids, with old people, reveal really a dialogue, a kind of communion. He really communed. It was a kind of a I think, and he also was very literate in terms of his photographic references. He knew Cartier-Bresson and so on, and Eisenstadt and Family of Man. He saw himself in those traditions. And like Cartier-Bresson said, you know, photographing is not really showing your originality. It's really a conversation. It's sometimes shouting, but more often than not a conversation, a way of communicating, not a way of showing your ego.
They are very highly accomplished photographs. They have a level of excellence, which probably in the language of photographers is probably very, very good. But what he does with that language is, it seems to be severely limited. He seems to have got to a certain point of accomplishment, and then sort of there doesn't seem to be anything else after that. The accomplishment seems to be the only triumph, in a way. But what he says with that degree of technical ability, it doesn't seem to expand more than that.
However, if you don't have strong mind, you cycle back into the point of tradition, which is where the documentary people are working from. They have to make a living. What do they make their livings from? How people expect to see the ordinary events that they've always seen forever and ever talked back to them. Well, you know, I just don't think it's very interesting after a while.
And Oscar's work seems to be 80% accidental. And maybe the 20% doesn't seem enough to fill in 80% accidental. These are, to me, the people who use photography to describe an idea, or to not to describe it, but to work in conjunction with an idea, are the most interesting.
Oscar's photographs have survived into a tougher world, a world that demands that an artist has an ego. It's no longer possible for a photographer to survive on passive observation, no matter how skillful or sympathetic. Space on a gallery wall is precious and has to be fought for.
You have people like Oscar working in a loose documentary tradition, or you could call it straight photography. Photography that relies on what happens between the photographer and the subject there at the moment of the photograph. It's part of his era as well. When he worked, photography was less well defined. It was easier for photographers not to pin themselves down.
Owen Logan will live with and relate to a community over a period of months, as he did here in Morocco. He wants his work to be less larcenous than straight documentary photography. There appears to be more of an open transaction between him and his subjects. He welcomes the opportunity to talk about his work, to define himself. It's a necessity in the hard-nosed art world of today. Thomas Joshua Cooper will willingly do the same.
After all, this is Britain, and everything that anybody does in Britain is related to a literal relationship with language. Documentary is probably going to last forever, though some of us would like to sidestep it very intensively. It's a way of using the camera and picture making to make representations of reality that are illusions, like a painter would or like a sculptor would, but that have an enormous, credible believability, but that are understood to be active, imaginary participations with making something believable. Areas of believability that are so exciting and so wonderful that they appear to be real when in fact they are pure constructions of the mind and imagination.
There is a good tradition of humanist photography. It's not very fashionable at the moment. Pictures of twigs are probably more fashionable in Scotland just now, and I don't think Oscar's work is fashionable with the kind of photography establishment, but it's very popular with a wide range of people, and that's because of the humanism, I think.
This is one of the Marzaroli images that's very commercially successful, I'm told. Lots of these posters are sold in Glasgow. I think I can understand why it's so popular. I think it's probably part of a mythology. I think it's, you know, part of something that people in Glasgow perhaps want to hang on to. It's part of an identity that they see as a Glasgow identity. But that doesn't make it a great photograph, or even a good photograph.
For me, there's some of those pictures of Oscar's Gorbel's pictures that are their own cliches. They've been seen forever, and they just don't have the sense of value or worth now that they may have had then. And it only undermines the incredible credibility of any working person's work when pictures that have degenerated into the nostalgic are allowed to be seen as hallmarks. Good editing is about attributing works that have achieved and sustained power rather than just achieved and sustained popularity.
Nostalgia, like sentiment, is a rather dangerous thing. It gets in the way of thinking about things, because you can look at a photograph which is headed "the way things were," and you can think, oh, that's interesting, that's the place next door to where I used to live, or isn't it quaint? And that is in a way destructive, and I suspect that something extremely interesting going on in the way of historical process there that we have not thought about at all. And I was interested, from that point of view, looking at Oscar's work the other day when there was a whole range of it. If you take a photograph like that, at the time, this is the hull of the QE2 coming up over the buildings in the dockyard. At the time, that was a perfectly ordinary thing that you wouldn't have worried about, you wouldn't have noticed. By now, of course, with the decline in the shipping industry, that's become a very much more powerful and extraordinary photograph.
It seems like many people in prime moving positions making Oscar Marzaroli into something like, I don't know what, trying to get into an artist who's our sole photographer, who photographs our souls, our history. This is a peculiar time in art where it kind of it's at the turn of the decade, turn of the century, nearly enough. So there should be some understanding of where do we go rather than where we've been in a way. And because this is 1990 cultural year, this show fits in, to me, too couthily with the old-fashioned ideas of Glasgow. We have Glasgow yuppies now looking back in our history saying, oh, look at what it was like when our parents were older, or look at all these poor people here, when we're all sort of cozy little yuppie ones now, sort of thing. I mean, whether it is art or no art doesn't matter. It doesn't feel right. It fits in too well with an idea of Glasgow which is prevalent at the minute, which isn't a healthy one. It's a smugness.
The Golden-Haired Lass, Gorbals, 1964, is, I think, the most favourite of all of Oscar's Glasgow photographs, and that has been reprinted innumerable times. Obviously, some have sold better, so there are certain cards which have been reprinted more than others. We're talking in terms of thousands. I mean, they've been reprinted consistently.
They're going to turn anything into a commodity. There's a bit of distance, I think, between then and now. That was 30 years ago. It's a kind of safe distance. It's in black and white. It's frozen in time. It's not like today, which is outside your flat and might break in and steal your video. It's a quaint view of the past. People are kind of yearning for a sense of place. It's not a kind of middle-class nostalgia. You'd have to ask them about nostalgia. It's a whole mixture of feelings. There's pain, there's dislocation, there's humour, there's looking for a sense of history. I mean, young people will look at Marzaroli's photographs and they might look at it with their parents, and their parents will say, that was what it was like for us. I don't think life ever was that simple, right? I think that in the past, it took a long time for that Glasgow culture to develop, and it will take another lot of years for a new, strong culture to develop in the city.
You do them up the road, you know where the beacon comes from?
The housing schemes built to replace the tenements are now in serious need of their own demolition. But all they get is a dose of cosmetic renovation, and you won't find an Annan or a Marzaroli celebrating it. Nowadays, the people own their own negatives.
People that would normally be the subject of documentary photographs have gone out and taken a view of the people of their city. From an insider's point of view, we've been all over the place: offices, shops, schools, pubs, clubs, mosques, churches, in the streets, taking photographs primarily of people. And we thought that it was quite a novelty and also quite a statement for local people to record life going on round about them. It's quite unique, I think.
Whether it's a local photographic project or a visiting film crew, ordinary people are in much more control of their relationship with the filming and the photographing classes.
What an interview, Amy.
It's hard to imagine anyone wanting to hang a photograph of this on their wall, even in 30 years' time. The fine, photogenic Victorian tenements have gone. and with them, the great liberal middle-class obsession for recording the doings of the poor. In Glasgow, Oscar was the last of that line. His record of 3 decades of photography remains, already seen as part of our visual heritage, already up for grabs.
This work should probably just be left to be looked at without being evaluated as yet. Just be left as part of a history of Glasgow. Not put up in here and say, oh, is it art, is it not art? Is this good or is it bad? Is this our history or is it not our history? It's something at the minute, because it's only been sort of really looked at recently, it's better just sort of looked at rather than put up as symbols of everyone's sort of childhood, or this is the city of Glasgow, or this is this is that.
Finding out what the real areas of concern were and either making an enormously beautiful definitive book or a series of small books. And then maybe to find collaborators that knew about the time and the histories so that you get text and image. But not just simply to show the old famous pictures over and over and over again, but to expand the idea of the guy's interests.
The number, I don't know whether Anne has ever sat down and worked out how many individual shots there are, but there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of them. And in time, you know, 100 years from now, they'll still be used. That's what it was like. That's what they were doing in Glasgow then. Now I can see, now I can understand, and that's the important thing.
Oscar is only 2 years dead, but in photographic terms, he's already history, like Annan or Helen Adamson.
Okay, that's the next sheet there.
His archive will survive the current obsession with nostalgia, as the family work to secure a proper place for it in Scotland's visual history.
Those are the two there and the one at the bottom, the one that's upside down.
Yes.
I wanted to find something that hadn't been printed before.
Owen Logan, a generation removed from Oscar, can happily spend an afternoon delving into Oscar's files, searching out an unprinted negative.
A lot of things were going right for him visually, but unfortunately, I think most of the negatives here are unsharp. I think it's probably camera shake. I think he was photographing at a relatively slow shutter speed, which might explain.
Owen never knew him in person, but this way he can relate to him in intimate ways, photographer to photographer.
These girls crossing to the church hall, presumably, crossing a road. The other image, which also looks quite like it could be quite good, is this one here. But I think I'm probably going to stick with this negative and try and make a good print from it. This picture of these girls, it's their first communion. Quite an unusual composition. I'm not going to crop it, and because this is in a way a posthumous print, I don't want to alter it too much. I just want to hold back the girls' faces here in the foreground, just a touch. I need to hold back the background where the parents are standing a lot more. I want to make a print that really conveys the quality of the original negative and is quite faithful to it.
Oscar's archive will find its uses. Over the years, researchers will pillage it. A social historian with a treatise to write, or a costume designer needing hints for a period TV drama. But this also means accepting the rigours of criticism and scrutiny. At over 100,000 negatives, the archive is probably big enough to take the knocks. And if a younger generation are talking and arguing about you, you're probably not all that dead.
This is the final print. It's actually better than I'd originally hoped for. It's an interesting image because, on one hand, it's very strong. Compositionally, it's very strong. This straight diagonal line of white going through the picture. But at the same time, it's very subtle. For instance, the way that the girl on the left is looking to the girl that's right on the corner here of the image. She's checking how her hands are against her friend's hands. And, of course, at the end there, the parents are on the other side of the road watching the ritual. Yeah, I'm quite pleased with this print, and I think it's one of Marzaroli's best images, really, because unlike his other pictures, some of his other pictures, it doesn't rely on a period quality. It's a good image now, not because it was taken 25 years ago or 30 years ago. It's simply a good image.
With the release of a charity album this week, the images of Oscar Marzaroli are put to music by some of Scotland's best-known bands. You can hear the songs and the stories behind them in a special programme which celebrates Songs for Oscar, Sunday the 27th, 11:25 on Scottish.
Stay tuned for Gulf News Report after this break.